So, if you remember, the trolley dilemma is about basically a juxtaposition between the deontological perspective, where it's not okay to harm a person, so you can't redirect the trolley to only kill one person instead of five, because then you would actively harm the people, the one person that you would sacrifice. This is the one side. And the other side, there is the utilitarian reasoning that actually you should divert the trolley to the other side so that you save the maximum number of people. So you save 5 instead of 1. So the idea here is, or there are some arguments to be made, that actually the deontological versus utilitarian reasoning process is different. So the dual process theory in morality makes the claim that deontological reasoning is sort of rather on the intuitional side. It's about having a moral intuition, having something like a snap judgment that says, oh no, I may not do any harm. While the other perspective, the utilitarian reasoning, actually requires some mental calculation. It requires to maximize well-being by overcoming the intuitions that you have that are deontological, and then saying, well, but no, I need to deliberate on this. I'm trying to do the best thing for the most people, and that means I have to do some math, and that's just more effortful, and it requires more deliberation. So this is the idea that morality, there are different modes of thinking. Just generally cognitively, I can be into intuitive mode versus in deliberate mode. And depending on which way I think, it supports a different type of moral decision. So being in a moral intuition mode, it supports a deontological reasoning kind of decision, or one that would follow from deontological reasoning. And being in a deliberative mode of thinking supports making utilitarian decisions because it supports utilitarian reasoning. So this is the dual process model in morality. And there's actually a bit of evidence about this. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of details because I've also kind of already hinted at this in the last lecture, but there's some evidence that indeed this is how thinking works. So if we downregulate how many resources people have available to make mental calculations, then we will see fewer utilitarian responses. If we upregulate how much power people have to experience emotions, or then we will see more deontological reasoning, and the other way around. We can also see this, this is just some more evidence that goes in the same direction. So I'm not going to go into more detail on that, but the main point is that here the argument of this dual process model is that deontological reasoning is supported by intuition, and utilitarian reasoning is thinking really hard. Now we have also a dual process model in prosociality. So this doesn't only exist for trying to explain moral decision making, but also for trying to explain prosocial decision making. And this kind of all got really popular with a study that basically tried to show whether humans are by nature, so intuitively, good prosocial, or if intuitively we are selfish. And this study got a whole lot of traction. For instance, here's a headline from Scientific American: "Scientists probe human nature and discover we are good after all." So let's talk a little bit about this study. The original study was a single-shot public goods game. And to remember from the previous lecture what the setup looks like, just in case you forgot some of it. So participants were in groups of 4, and each participant received an individual endowment of $4, and then they could contribute their money to a common project. And the money contributed, so they could contribute any amount, so either keep all to themselves or contribute half to the common project, or contribute all, so €4 to the common project. And whatever they would contribute would then be doubled and split equally, independently of how much the other people contributed, right? So the individually rational thing to do is to just keep your money to yourself and hope for everyone else to invest everything. But as a group, the commonly rational thing is to invest everything, because then you can maximize how much money is available in the end. So individual earnings could be up to $10. And now this is the important part, 2 treatments. There was a time pressure treatment where participants were instructed to make their choice within 10 seconds. And there was a forced delay treatment where participants were asked to make their choice after 10 seconds. Why? Well, the idea is if we force people to make their choice quickly, we kind of we enforce them to be in an intuitive decision mode. We don't even leave them the time to elaborate on what they are going to do, but we ask them for snap judgment. We ask them for the intuitive judgment, and then we should see here if there are more choices of a certain kind, those would be the ones supported by intuitive rationality. But in the forced delay treatment, this is where we encourage people to think, right? We don't let them make a choice just based on their intuition, but we make them wait. And while you wait, what do? You think. And therefore, in the forced delay treatment, this would be the treatment where we would expect greater deliberation of the decisions. So the decisions that we see there would be the ones that we would expect are supported by a deliberate system. Now, what did we see in the results? Here is the contribution. So what percentage of the $4 people were endowed with in the beginning did participants invest in this common pool? So that this is a measure of cooperation, of course, so that everyone in this group could benefit. Under time pressure, more than 65% of the original endowment was contributed. In the time delay condition, it was below 55%, around about 50%. And in the unconstrained condition, this is the third condition I have omitted from the overview I gave you before, where it was neither time pressure nor time delay, that was somewhere in the middle. So if we were to interpret this, we could say that giving in this case was actually spontaneous, and being greedy or selfish was the calculated, more deliberate response. And this led to the formulation of the social heuristics hypothesis. Basically the idea that cooperation happens fast and being selfish is slow. The social heuristics hypothesis proposes that people internalize typically successful behaviors in their intuitive heuristics for their social interactions. And because of the fact that most of our interactions are actually long-term, our heuristics support these long-term interactions. What does this mean? Well, we play the long game, and playing the long game means it's necessary for us to cooperate. Because if we only play a prisoner's dilemma one time, maybe it makes sense for us to try to free ride. But if we do this 200 times with the same people, or 200 times with people who actually know of the choices we've made before, or have like some way of hearing about this, gossip for instance, if we do that, then it becomes just impossible to get good outcomes, because no one will let you free ride, right? No one will expect that you actually contribute, while you never do. At some point, people will learn, and they will just not cooperate with you. And that, in the end, is bad for your own outcomes. So in order to play the long game, you have to cooperate with people. And that then becomes the heuristic for us in these situations. So the heuristic, this is what this theory argues, is to cooperate. However, deliberation refocuses us on the specific situation and therefore supports selfishness. Now, because this study is actually so incredibly interesting, there was a lot of attention to it. And part of this attention was also what we call a registered replication report. So a group of researchers actually got together to try to replicate the previous study that I just explained to you. And the idea here was to review this study and register it before the data and results would be known. So that the results would be published no matter if they pointed in the same direction as the original piece of research or if they went in the opposite direction. And actually this piece of research, this registration was really quite involved, because it also involved asking the original authors about their opinion about the replication plan. So it was important that they would be like on board and agree that this would be the best possible test of their original hypothesis. And then there was a publicly posted replication plan that invited other labs to join. So there was one group that proposed this replication, and then other labs could just join for the data collection. There was also some funding for participant fees, and there could also theoretically be funding for scan time and training coders, but that wasn't necessary here. This is just part of what a registered report is, and why I think that format is really cool. And then, like I said, the publication of the outcomes of this replication attempt would be regardless of whether, in which direction they would go. And the materials and data are actually shared openly. So if you want to know more about this replication report that I am about to talk to you about, you can just go on the internet and find it, and you can read the materials and look at the data yourself. You can play with the data, that's always fun. And then along with the publication of this data and this report, there was also a peer-reviewed publication of a comment by the original authors. So it's really a very cool format that's quite extensive in what it can do. And that was done here because this question of whether being pro-social is actually intuitive to us is such an important question. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the results of this registered replication report. By now you are kind of familiar with these types of plots, where we have the effect size of the original study in the very top. So original study, you can see the size of the effect plus a confidence interval. Those are the whiskers around it. And then you can see below that the effects found in the labs that participated in the replication attempt. And what you can see here is that overall, and this is all the way in the bottom, the summary effect basically. Overall, there was a significant effect in the predicted direction, such that indeed under time pressure there was more giving, more cooperation than under time delay. And this was the main finding from the original study, right? Right, but this is there's a little bit. Yeah, there are actually a couple of layers to this result, because you only get to this result if you look at participants who actually stuck to the instructions. So people who gave their choice, they waited out their 10 seconds if they were in the time delay condition, or they gave their choice within the 10 seconds if they were in the time pressure condition. We call this compliant participants. So participants who complied with the instructions or with the manipulation, if you want, then we find this effect. But if we take a look at overall the difference between the two treatments, and we don't restrict the effect only to people who comply, then we actually don't find it anymore. And then we also don't find it in the original study. So this only works for people who stick to the instructions, and if people don't stick to the instructions, then we don't find any evidence for the effect that there is a difference in giving depending on the time pressure versus delay condition. So this is actually showing the same thing. So if you exclude none of the participants, you take the full sample in the registered replication, then you see here that actually the effect overlaps 0, so there is no evidence for an effect. But if you exclude participants who are experienced, that doesn't change it much. If you exclude participants who don't understand what they're supposed to do, that also doesn't change it much. But if you take out the people who don't comply, this is the stuff I circled in pink, then what we see is that we actually find an effect, and this is also what we find overall. Then we find that cooperation is intuitive, but we don't find it overall. So what is the problem with this? You might say, well, that's fine. Just kick out the people who don't comply. Well, it's actually a matter of who we kick out. So in the time pressure condition, about 34% of people were compliant. In the time delay condition, about 92% of people were compliant. And we have to wonder, who are the people who comply to these instructions, and what does that do to them? So in a way, we might be talking about some selection bias here. And that might call into question our results for this study. So all in all, I would say that the question on whether prosociality is actually intuitive is still open. Now, finally, I promised you that we would take one tiny step beyond the dual process theory and take a look at one more piece of influence on how people make decisions, and this is choice difficulty. And let me just simply pitch this idea to you that actually, if I have more extreme preferences, so I have a kind of a set opinion on what I like and what I think is important and what matters, then in order to make a choice, it's easier for me. right? Because choice options become more readily discriminable. Now, what do I mean by that? Imagine, I gave this example before, but imagine you have a muffin and an apple, and you really, really, really don't like baked goods. So then you have the choice between something that you really, really don't like and an apple. That means those are quite wildly different for you. And then it's really easy for you to choose the apple. Mm-hmm. But now consider a situation where you kind of like muffins, you kind of like apples. So now the options are actually pretty close together in terms of how much you like them. And then to pick one, it's pretty difficult, right? Because, the kind of the gratification that you could get from them is so similar that it's difficult to pick the one that would be better. And that's the idea behind choice difficulty. And we can also apply this to social preferences. So people who have extremely selfish preferences, who are extremely selfish, or on the other hand, people who are extremely cooperative, well, they can make choices quickly because it's actually easy for them to choose. If I am a super cooperative person, I will, like that, decide to cooperate. But if I'm a person who's kind of on the fence, who's in the middle and who's sort of undecided, well, then it's going to be difficult for me to make that choice and it's going to take long. And there's some more research that actually the reaction time effect that we saw for giving, so that giving is faster than keeping to yourself. Being selfish is slow. If we control for choice difficulty, this reaction time effect can actually be diminished. So that indeed, choice difficulty, how tricky it is for a person to come up with their preference to decide which of the things they like better, that this might actually be another explanatory reason for why sometimes decisions take more or less effort and more or less time. So that is it for this session, in which we've talked about moral foundations theory, cognitive developmental theory of morality, the Kohlberg rational theory of morality. We've talked about emotions as well, or rather moral dumbfounding in the social intuitionist model of morality. And then we've talked about dual process, both in morality and prosociality. Finally, we've taken a tiny, tiny look at choice difficulty. And this is all we're going to do in this session. I hope you stay safe and sane and healthy. And I'll see you in the next session of Social Cognition. Bye.